Hello, all. I'm King John. You're you, and you're pretty awesome. Keep it up. I'd like to talk to you about the Jaffna Hospital Massacre, which you probably haven't heard about because, firstly, it took place quite some time ago in 1987, and secondly, because it took place in Sri Lanka, which, although some really horrible things took place there, and to some extent are still taking place there, Um, the world really doesn't seem to care very much, which is kind of awful in my opinion. I don't think the lives of anyone in Sri Lanka are less valuable or less newsworthy than the lives of anyone anywhere else. So, at least in part, to try to draw attention to the fact that there are things worth noting taking place there, I want to talk to you about this. So a bit of background: the Jaffna Peninsula on the island of Sri Lanka is largely inhabited by people of the Tamil minority. And well, there's a lot of background I won't get into, but there has been a lot of conflict between various ethnic groups in Sri Lanka for a very long time. In the 1980s, the Indian government decided to get involved, sending peacekeepers to Sri Lanka, and peacekeepers in this instance really ought to be said with air quotes because they, well, they kind of took sides. And the side being against the Tamils, or at least against the Liberation Tigers, which was a militant group of Tamils. Now, the Indian Army began operating in the Jaffna Peninsula, and there was a lot of fighting there. Until on the night of the 21st, I think, October 21st, 1987, I think that's what it was, Indian troops attacked the hospital, and they killed a lot of people there. I won't go into any of the graphic details, but I suggest that if this is the sort of thing that you care about, you should look it up because it's worth remembering. Now, the Indian Army claimed that their troops were fired on from the hospital, and that civilians died in shooting between the Indian soldiers and Tamil Tigers. Based on the available evidence, that last seems to be very untrue. That they were fired on from the hospital, that is possible. A doctor at the hospital reported that he did see armed fighters there, at least two groups of them, and there are reports that there are signs that someone was shooting from the hospital. So it does seem likely that the Indian soldiers were in fact fired on from the hospital. And then after some time, some Indian soldiers were sent to take the hospital. And the available evidence says that they then proceeded to kill just about everyone they could. Now, this is one of the better documented massacres in recent history. And it shows, I think, a very important lesson in how massacres happen with modern militaries, as opposed to various tribal militias and so forth. Because the Indian soldiers who were sent to the hospital seem to have been sent with no instructions, no standing orders about how to deal with civilians. They were not. They seem to have had no rules about how to respond when fired on, or how to act when they're not being fired on, going into an area filled with civilians, which shows an incredible lack of professionalism, which is very strange because historically the Indian Army was renowned for being very professional. Of course, that was the British Indian Army, but I digress. Now, this seems to show an extreme lack of caring in among the Indian Army's officer corps that was present. How high up it went, I don't know, but it must have gone up pretty far for there to be no standing instructions or anything for the actual Indian soldiers, who were technically peacekeepers. Now, having no instructions for peacekeepers in dealing with civilians, that is, well, pretty far out there. Now, this lack of caring, like I said, I don't know how far up it went, possibly all the way up to the political leaders who sent them in the first place. That's entirely possible and would in part explain why India, the Indian government at least, has tried very hard to bury the entire incident and basically deny anything ever happened. And the unfortunate fact is that nobody noticed. There are some conflicts, some areas that are prone to conflict in the world that get a lot of notice. Trying hard not to reference Israel-Palestine right now and failing. And there's an awful lot of the rest of the world that just gets ignored by the world at large until and unless something happens to catch the world's notice, e.g., Ukraine. Morally, I this is evil. You should not treat different people's lives as if they matter more or less than other people's lives just because they take place in one part of the world or another, or just because it's a conflict involving one group of people versus another. And if you consider yourself a moral person, then you have a responsibility to try to keep yourself educated about, well, things like the Jaffna Hospital Massacre. Even though it occurs in a place that's largely ignored by the news, even though it took place between combatants who are largely ignored, even though this is something that you actually need to look for, to learn about. This is not something that's going to pop up in your feed anywhere, anytime. Not just this massacre in particular, but the entire conflict in Sri Lanka is largely just never noticed. So if you are a moral person, put the effort in. Because you do need to put effort in to be a moral person. I didn't mean to preach at you at the end there, so I hope I didn't offend you. But what I said is true. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Please comment below with anything you have to say. I would like to hear from you. And in the meantime, have a good night and God bless.